Okay, today we're going to be discussing what the economy looks like in the United States after World War One. The reason we're looking at what the United States economy looks like is because the U.S. is basically the most powerful nation on earth after World War One. Europe had pretty much been decimated by the war. Europe's colonies, which were all over the world, were still under colonial power. And then the Russian economy was basically in the middle of a transformation. Um, and so the United States was pretty much the only reliable, solid economy. And so the United States economy would kind of be the model for the rest of the world and would impact the rest of the world. Um, but what we want to look at today is what happens when that economy falls apart. Because when the United States economy crashes, for lack of a better word, um, that is going to impact everything in Europe. That's going to impact things in Asia. And it's going to lead to big world events like the rise of Hitler and the Great Depression and even World War II. So, in order to figure out how this economy falls apart, we need to look at what value is, what a consumer economy is, how that consumer economy breaks down, and the consumer economy is the United States, and why that matters. So, first of all, what gives value in a consumer economy? Um, Here we need to figure out a few terms. So, supply, first of all, is the amount of something. Demand is how much somebody's wanting that product. And then value is kind of a combination. It's the worth of a product given its supply and its demand. Um, the real value is sometimes this kind of like philosophical idea. Well, like how much is this actual product worth inherently? But that's pretty hard to figure out. Generally, people figure that out by adding up the cost of all the other pieces that went into it. But even those smaller costs are really measured in market value. So, market value is basically how much somebody's willing to pay for a product given its supply and its demand. So, let's use Sprite as an example. There's really no need for Sprite to exist if you think about it. I mean, it's just water and sugar and that's it. And then plastic and a label. Sprite in itself is like the perfect widget, right? And a widget again is this idea of like any manufactured product. So if we're going to try and figure out its value, we start with what goes into it. So corn. Corn gets turned into corn syrup, which is kind of the sugar and really the dominant piece of Sprite. You've got polymers that go into making plastic. You've got trees that go into making this paper and then the label. So you could think of the real value of Sprite as all these pieces put together. But the easier way of thinking about this is like the production cost, or how much it actually costs to make this. Um, but you don't want to pay just, or a company doesn't want to get just what they had to pay to make it, right? They want to make a profit. And so the easiest way to do that is to increase its market value by increasing customer demand for it. In other words, you want to make it attractive to people. So you get somebody like LeBron James to sell the Sprite, or you find some reason for people to want the Sprite. So again, production costs, that's just how much the raw materials and the labor and all that costs to go into it. The market value is usually higher if the company's doing a good job. And it's just this kind of like, magic dust that makes it more attractive to people. And usually that comes from an advertisement. This difference in the production cost and market value, that's your profit. So the real value of Sprite is sometimes kind of hard to determine, right? But the market value, that's how much people are willing to pay for it. And that pretty much depends on consumer demand. Um, Now, if that manufactured product doesn't get sold in the United States in the 1920s and really still today, the whole economy kind of falls apart because all these different pieces of the economy, whether it's raw materials or laborers, they all depend on the sale of that product, of that widget. That's why today we measure most capitalist countries in terms of GDP. Actually, most countries we measure in terms of GDP, total amount of what they make, gross domestic product. So it's the total amount of things that they produce in a year. So The key here is that in a consumer economy, and we're going to learn what a consumer economy is in just a sec, but the United States economy in the 1920s, real value was really how much are people willing to pay for a widget, right? If you can't sell the widget, it has no value. So, what's a consumer economy? The US is a really good definition of a consumer economy, especially in the 1920s. It was democratic and it has this emphasis on freedom, right? People's ability to do what they want. They had a free market with few regulations in the 1920s. They had some, but not very many. It was also industrial, which meant that it focused on manufacturing things. And the 1920s was really kind of this new time for manufactured products. And maybe most importantly, the United States was full of natural resources for various reasons that we don't need to get into right now. But the U.S. has maybe the best geography of any nation on earth. And after World War I, the U.S. was completely uninterested in any kind of foreign affairs. All they wanted to do was focus on manufacturing products and making money. And with good reason. I mean, they had just been involved in a really deadly war, and a lot of people didn't really know why the U.S. had fought in the first place. But U.S. businesses had made a lot of money during the war, and so they could just keep their factories going, and instead of producing weapons, they could start producing things like vacuum cleaners. So the United States in the 1920s becomes a consumer economy. What they basically do, and the way the whole economy runs, is that they manufacture products that people will want. They do this through mass production, right? All these different people working in an assembly line and then marketing it and then distributing it and then selling it in stores. So they manufacture products that the middle class is going to want, and they manufacture demand, or they increase the market value through advertising. So this entire economy, again, depends on selling consumer products. If people don't buy the products, it shuts down. So the best way to increase market value, to make people want to buy these products, is through advertisements. And a lot of times the products are worthless. So here's, soap that basically they had too much soap and they didn't know what to do with it. So they start marketing it as somehow washing away body fat, right? Here you had a company that probably had too much excess metal. So they market it as a thumb guard so a baby doesn't suck its thumb. Here you have, how you market Coca-Cola. Well, you can make it look like a milk bottle, right? You can get more of it so you can buy more at a time. And all of these different products were given these advertising campaigns: the automobile, oil, radio, fashionable clothing, not just clothing that you wear, but clothing that is a particular fashion. Dishwashers, refrigerators, packaged food, sliced bread comes around for the first time, movies, new houses, so an additional house. I mean, all of these products basically are an attempt to get you to buy something that you don't really need. Because if you don't, then the economy shuts down. People don't have enough money to eat what they do need, right? Which is food. So the idea here is that the United States at this time, in the 1920s, produces tons and tons of stuff. And what happens is if no one buys that stuff, then no one continues to make money making stuff. So it's this kind of difficult concept to grasp. Here is a little clip. It's from a movie called Wall Street in 1987. It's a pretty famous clip, and it's about a guy named Gordon Gekko, who is this this stock market guy, and he's trying to explain how the U.S. economy works. Now, you've already seen a clip from the 1939 General Motors movie Round and Round about selling widgets and what happens if people don't buy the widgets. But this is another way of thinking about the economy. It's a little bit more pessimistic. So I want you to stop and watch clip 1 from Wall Street. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I want you to respond to that at the appropriate question on your note template. When you're ready, you can move on. Hopefully, though, you're starting to think of this in terms of what we've already learned about, like the invisible hand and free trade. The idea of Adam Smith's laissez-faire capitalism and free trade is that everybody looks out for themselves, and if that happens, then the economy is going to keep running. We'll get to criticisms of this later, but for now, this is how a consumer economy works. You have everybody who is looking out for their own interests, and if people actually want things, they're going to buy things that help them, right? So what we're going to do now is look at what happens when this breaks down, because at some point people aren't going to want to keep buying things. A big problem with this, or a part of this, is that people speculate. In other words, one way that you can make money is you buy a share of a stock of a company that you think is going to keep doing well. So the idea is you buy a share of the stock. As the company does better, you can sell that stock and you can make money from it because its market value has gone up and you can make a profit. There are also some stocks where you invest in it and it pays you like a small percentage over time as the company does better. But for the most part, people made money by buying a cheap stock and selling it when it gets expensive. And this is called speculation. It's buying something and selling it when it later becomes more popular. And in the 1920s, for the first time, you have the average American is able to invest in stocks. And this becomes this big boom where not only are people producing and sometimes buying things that they don't actually need, now people are betting on the fact that people are going to want to keep doing this. And so you have this kind of convoluted economy that takes place. Speculation depends on the idea that people are going to keep wanting to buy products. So the problem is, at some point, people are going to stop buying a product, and what happens then? A good example of what happens would be in the 1920s. There's a land crash. Actually, it happens in Florida. Florida was at the time pretty sparsely populated. There really wasn't anyone there. And over time, these wealthy Americans on the East Coast started to leave the East Coast during the winter to go to Florida because they realized that it's sunny and wonderful in the winter. And what happens is real estate speculators started buying up land and trying to develop into housing developments before these wealthy people got there. So the idea was that they were trying to buy stuff up, and other people were investing in land, and they were basically speculating, thinking that everybody was going to want land. But there's only so many wealthy people who can afford to buy land in Florida, and so what happened is people, exaggerated the demand. They basically speculated too much, and soon there were so many new housing developments and new land for sale that there just wasn't enough people to buy it. So the supply outpaced the real demand. And by 1926, the land market had collapsed. Basically, all the housing prices were cheap. No one could really sell their houses. And for, a couple decades, Florida was this like backwater where you had a lot of wealthy people and then a lot of empty land that had basically been foreclosed on. You also have this problem where people are able to get loans from banks, and banks are giving out so many loans that they don't have the money to back them up. So a lot of people in the 1920s were able to buy stocks or land or consumer products on credit. Basically, this is assuming that they're going to keep making money and eventually they'll have the money. So even banks were kind of betting on the fact that these people would eventually get the money to pay back their loans, which didn't happen. And it didn't happen in 2008 either, which we'll talk about. There's another clip that you can watch on Schoology. It's from Wall Street again. It's this idea that everyone thinking the economy is going to do well means that you can make money from it, everybody thinking it's going to do well. The illusion has become real, and the more real it becomes, the more desperately they want it. So the idea is like, if you say the economy is going to do well, you'll keep producing, people will keep buying, and all that's really stopping them, or all that's really stopping the economy from continuing, is if people stop buying these things. So I want you to pause this and watch the second clip and see what you think. Okay, so eventually all this is going to fall apart, right? So by the end of the 1920s, people have enough vacuum cleaners, they have enough refrigerators, production starts to slow, people start getting laid off, which means they don't have money to buy things anymore. Stock prices begin to fluctuate, meaning they're going up. Everybody is thinking, oh, the economy is going to do better. Then they go way down because people start to think, oh, the whole economy is going to fall apart. We got to sell all of our shares now. Eventually, it starts to tilt towards going down. The stock market on a Tuesday in October 1929 free falls, which basically means everybody is trying to sell everything they have. Um, and in a day, you have about 16 million shares traded. Um, it's not necessarily, it would be wrong to think that everybody knows what they're doing here. It's usually one person hears something and they want to get rid of all their shares because they're nervous. Or one person hears something and they want to buy all these shares because they think that maybe they'll make money because the stock market's cheap at that time. So it's this guessing game. The stock market is not necessarily it's not the reason why the depression happened, but it's a good indicator of why it happened. Why a depression happens in a consumer economy is because people stop buying things. Demand falls, and even in the 1920s, after this crash, production kept up for a little while. And what happened is, as production continues to go up, and no one is buying things, suddenly you have this massive oversupply of everything. And so in the Depression, when you have people who are homeless, people who don't have jobs, there's still plenty of stuff around. And the problem is no one can afford to buy it. That the market value has gone down so much, and so there's no more production, and so no one has money to buy anything. So the Depression had really three factors or characteristics: high unemployment, low wages, and reduced demand. So basically, no one has a job. The people who do have a job have a low wage because workers are in such a high supply. And no one wants to buy anything because no one has any money. So this leads to this downward spiral where the whole economy shuts down. So here in the United States, you've got this graph that shows unemployment just shoots up past 20% in the 1930s, based on some policies in FDR's New Deal and Second New Deal. The unemployment rate starts to go down. You can learn about that in U.S. history. And then once World War II starts, that's really when unemployment goes down because everybody gets a job producing for the war effort. Another way of looking at the Depression is industrial production. You can see right around 1929, it really starts to shut down, and it drops quite a bit by the mid-1930s. Something to keep in mind is consumer demand is supposed to be what's fueling production, but oftentimes people produce and then they try and find a reason for the consumer to buy it. So why did this all happen? The biggest reason is that production outpaced demand. There was too many things and not enough people to buy it. But you also had things like speculation, where people had unrealistic ideas about how much people would buy. You also had banks playing a big role. Banks were giving out too much money to people who couldn't actually afford to pay those loans back. And then that meant that banks couldn't get their money back and they fell apart. And maybe the biggest reason here, or maybe the biggest effect here, is that this leads to a global collapse across the world. So let's take a look at that. First of all, Germany is maybe the most affected by this. Germany after World War One basically got all the blame, partly because they lost, but also because they were the ones who had first invaded France. And so Germany owed all this money after World War One for war reparations, basically like damages for the war. And they had to pay France and Britain. And a lot of people thought they were unfair. This was way too much money. But Germany was still stuck with the cost. The U.S., instead of deciding to make Germany pay them back, they forgave Germany their debts because Germany had bought a bunch of stuff from the U.S. in the World War One, and instead they just basically gave them loans so they could buy American stuff. So banks were giving Germany all these loans, even though it was pretty clear that Germany wouldn't be able to pay these back. The idea was they'd buy enough American products that it would be fine. So Germany was using all this foreign money to fuel their economy. Meanwhile, they were paying that money to France and Britain, who were in turn using foreign money to fuel their economy. What happened was when the US economy crashed, you had basically the Germans couldn't get any more money from the US, and the German economy couldn't then pay any money to France and Britain. So the German economy started to fall apart. This had come after 12 years of the German economy struggling to find a way to keep going. This was on top of German resentment that they had to pay all this money, and this idea that like foreign powers were somehow like controlling their economy. And in 1933, you had Hitler, who we'll learn about later, who promised to basically give people back their jobs, make everything nationalized, so this would all be German stuff. And he even decided he would conquer lands that had been taken from them in World War One. This wasn't unique to Germany, although Hitler was, evil in his own way, and probably, he was not alone, right? You had dictators coming to power in Japan, Italy, Spain, Russia, and they all promised full employment and national glory, and in exchange they got power from the people. And the aggression of these big states that had dictators in power was really what would lead to World War II. A second big reason this matters is socialism, which is this kind of counterattack to capitalism and the consumer economy. Just to review democracy, this is a system in which people have decision-making power. A democracy can be socialist or capitalist. A socialist state is one in which the community as a whole, not private companies or individuals, owns and regulates the means of production, distribution, exchange. Usually they do this through the government. A socialist system can be democratic. A communist system is basically an ideal, and it's a system in which there is supposed to be no classes and no inequality. It's kind of this extreme form of socialism. This can also be democratic, but it is pretty hard to pull off. Karl Marx was a big proponent of trying to get communists to overthrow capitalist systems. He kind of predicted things like this in the 2008 crash and then in the 1920s crash. Basically, that the rich would keep getting richer, and they would kind of ruin it for everybody. So ultimately, he thought the greediest capitalists were the most successful, and they would replace the less greedy capitalists. So it's survival of the greediest. He also thought that wealth inequality and these cycles of economic depression were common to capitalism. At some point, people wouldn't buy stuff and the economy would shut down. And when that happened, the least fortunate were going to be the ones that suffer the most. And that's exactly what happened. The laborers are the first to get laid off. So what he thought is that the workers or the laborers, they needed a share in the means of production. They needed to be part owners of the company and make decisions with the company in order to prevent another crash. And he is kind of the counterpart to Gordon Gekko. He doesn't think greed is good. He thinks you need people to kind of keep it in check. And so in a lot of ways, there are many people today who still use a lot of Karl Marx's ideology, this idea that you need workers to have a share in the process. And so socialist thought takes on multiple forms. In some ways, it leads to regulations of banks and the stock market. But in other instances, it leads to full-on new states. And the USSR is a good example of this. The USSR had been struggling to come together as a state throughout the 1920s. And it's really in the 1930s where the USSR begins to have this massive production output because it doesn't depend on consumer demand. It just depends on coercing people into making things. And so the USSR in the 1930s is going to emerge as this massive rival to capitalist countries all over the place, including the US. But another reason why this matters is because it still happens. This speculation is what led to further depressions in the US history and across the world, especially in 2008. In 2008, basically, the market values of homes went up too much. So the 2008 financial crisis was another example of speculation, and this time it was a housing market that collapsed. So just like the stock market, you had housing prices going up, going up, going up, going up, and then at some point the average home price was massively over the median home price. And what this meant was at some point people had over speculated how much homes should be sold for. And everybody was getting loans that they could buy these homes. So the idea was that the economy was growing so much that everybody would be able to own a home. Um, Meanwhile, because they thought the economy was going up, the market value of homes kept going up too. So people thought that the economy would just keep on going. And banks started to provide people homes that couldn't actually afford these homes. And they didn't require the capital that you needed to back up your loans. And so people who got these loans eventually couldn't pay them back. When people couldn't pay back their loans, the banks didn't have enough money to cover the costs, and the banks fell apart. When the banks fell apart, nobody could get a loan, and it meant that the whole consumer economy fell apart. In part because everybody who had bought a house didn't have money to actually buy consumer products. So what happened is the United States GDP went down and it fell much behind a lot of the rest of the world, especially the parts of the world that used to be colonies. And so today you have this kind of fall off of what used to be all these big European and American powers that are being rivaled now by what used to be known as the Third World and colonial powers. So just in review, um, we learned about how capitalism, if left rampant, can kind of collapse in on itself, can make itself fall apart. And as a result, we're going to see everything from the rise of socialism to the rise of authoritarian powers to World War II. But we're also getting a glimpse into why depressions still happen today. Okay?